Good evening. Glad that you could join us for midweek Bible study. Still want to encourage you to come and be a part of this live if you can, or if you're physically able. We would certainly love to have you and certainly get into a lot of conversation that we don't necessarily get into, obviously, when you're just watching a video. So we want to encourage you to participate in that way. Now, you can always reach out to the church. You can get a hold of me. Anytime that you need me practically, you can just call the church, or you can send some information to the church if you have some questions about Bible study or anything like that if for some reason you can't join us. Now, I do want to give you just a little bit of an announcement. I'm going to be out next week, and so what's going to happen next week is chapter 22. So today we're going to cover chapters 19, 20, and 21. Chapter 22 is going to be covered live by another teacher, and it'll happen. It won't be recorded, so just be aware of that. So if you want to join us to catch up with that, you'll need to come to the live part of that on Wednesday evening. But just wanted to let you know that in advance. Would love to tell you that I can be in multiple places at one time, but I can't. I'm just letting you know. And so as we get started this evening, I'm kind of making up. I did 19 last week live, and apparently I forgot to put it up on the recording. I'd done some stuff in advance in preparation for being gone. I must have forgotten it, or I can't seem to find where I posted it. So I'm making up with that, or making up for that, and adding it in with the other two that I'm covering this evening. So I just want to get you, you've got a whole lot more information than you probably need. But anyway, as we get started in this, and chapter 19's a little bit different, and it's also going to kind of go through chapter 20, and we're going to see this judgment that's kind of levied against Egypt. And the first 15 verses point to three different areas of Egypt that Egypt actually believed that they were powerful. And so these areas, first, like verses 1 through 4, they focus on the religious beliefs of Egypt. And so the Egyptians believed that they were very spiritual people, and those religious beliefs would be important to them for guidance and many other things. And so this would be an attack on those first. Verses 5 through 10, it's going to focus on the physical situation in Egypt. You'll see that as it relates to the Nile River and some of those things. And then verses 11 through 15 is the third part, and it's going to focus on the country's wisdom. And so all of these things, keep in mind that Egypt believed that they were a very wise country, and so their wisdom was very well talked about, had a lot of philosophers, those type things, and so therefore they leaned on their wisdom, if you will. And so all of these things would be exposed in the midst of this proclamation, if you will, against Egypt. And so as we get started, the first verse says, "The burden against Egypt. Behold, the Lord rides on a swift cloud and will come into Egypt. The idols of Egypt will totter at his presence, and the heart of Egypt will melt in its midst." And so the Lord rides on a swift cloud, and that's what it says. And this kind of points to the incredible speed with which the Lord will operate. It's not something that is slow and steady. It's something that's very quick and very decisive. And so there's no hesitation by the Lord to be able to respond to what's going on and to be able to address it. The thing is, for Egypt, it would be overwhelming for them as well. And so you got to keep in mind that the Lord has power over nature. And this would hit very hard at the core of Egyptian worship. And so being able to swiftly do this and to take out the idol part of that, or the godly focus, their spiritual focus, it would be very devastating for them. You remember too that the Egyptians had plenty of idols, or plenty of we'll call them little g gods, that were responsible for different parts of nature. So you have the sun god, you have a god of fertility, you have a god of of crops, you have a god of harvest, you have all these different things that are going on. And so all of these would take out different specific pieces of the heart, if you will, of Egypt. And so God would address this first. In verse 2, it says, I will set Egyptians against Egyptians. Everyone will fight against his brother, and everyone against his neighbor, city against city, kingdom against kingdom. And the interesting thing about this, it might give you kind of, unfortunately, a picture of what our world looks like, or at least our country looks like right now, where we kind of have two political systems battling each other, and instead of trying to find some sort of common ground, because we are people, right? We have these grenades that keep getting thrown back and forth, and so there's this destruction that's happening because there's just forces against each other. And there would be a lot of confusion in Egypt because of the swift nature of what was going on, and the fact that all the things that they held near and dear were being taken away one by one. And unfortunately, it would lead to a fractioned nation. So when it's divided, just like Abraham Lincoln said, divided, when they're divided, they'll fail or fall. Verse 3, it says, the spirit of Egypt will fail in its midst, and I will destroy their counsel, and they will consult the idols and the charmers, the mediums and the sorcerers. And essentially, the destruction would leave the people searching for aid. They're looking for help from anywhere. And the normal chain of command, if you will, and their faith foundation would be destroyed, and there would be nowhere for them to go to find help. Verse 4 says, and the Egyptians I will give into the hand of a cruel master, and a fierce king will rule over them, says the Lord of hosts. Now here the thought is that Isaiah is practicing or predicting a rule by a tyrant or to oppress the people. I'm not really sure that that's what it is, but it may simply actually just point to the general degradation of the nation. So in the section that would follow, it would start addressing the physical nature of the things that would be destroyed. And when you look at the three pieces, which was the religious nature, the physical nature, and then also the wisdom part of it, when you start taking those things out of the equation, and the normal way that you get help, the normal way that you do things, the normal way that you respond to catastrophe or even respond just to daily life, if those things are removed, all of a sudden it's as if you are being persecuted and there's nothing you can do about it. You just kind of have to grin and bear it. And so maybe that's part of it. Now, in the next section, the verses 5 through 10, we see the physical situation of Egypt. And what I want you to imagine is a nation like Egypt, which is a lot of desert, but also has the Nile River, where there's a lot of production, grazing, clothes, you name it. All that stuff's happening because the water brings life to everything. I want you to try to think about what it would look like if the Nile River were to dry up and there would be no water there. And if you depended upon everything in your livelihood, in your life, your family, everything, if you depended upon the Nile River to bring that to you, even trade, and imagine all of that gone. And that's kind of what they're facing right here. So look at verse 5. It says, the waters will fail from the sea, and the river will be wasted and dried up. Now, verse 5 mentions the sea, and that appears to be the Nile. And a time when it is wasted and dried up would be a devastating event to Egypt. Look here further, verse 6 and 7, it says, the rivers will turn foul, the brooks of defense will be emptied and dried up, the reeds and rushes will wither, the papyrus reeds by the river, by the mouth of the river, and everything sown by the river will wither, be driven away, and be no more. The fishermen also will mourn, all those will lament who cast hooks into the river, and they will languish who spread nets on the waters. Now, as a result of the river drying up, plant marine life would be non-existent as well. They would die. Keep in mind that Egypt exported a lot of grain to the rest of the world, or the rest of the known world at that time. And the effects that would happen in Egypt would be effective for great distances, unfortunately, and a great many people. However, it would severely weaken them to a point of desolation, and a good percentage of their efforts to feed their people was done through fishing as well, and so the marine life going away would cause many to suffer, both economically and physically. Verse 9 says, "Moreover, those who work in fine flax and those who weave fine fabric will be ashamed." Now, the making of flax was totally dependent upon water, and this would affect, you have to understand, every industry, because everything that they did had something to do with water, or something that came out of the water, or something that drank the water, or something. It had something to do with water. Verse 10 and 11, it says, "And its foundations will be broken. All who make wages will be troubled of soul. Surely the princes of Zoan are fools. Pharaoh's wise counselors give foolish counsel. How do you say to Pharaoh, I am the son of the wise, the son of ancient kings?" Now, this focuses on the effects of what would happen to every class of person. So it doesn't matter whether you have money or you don't have money, so you're wealthy or poor, it doesn't matter. It's going to affect every person. And so ultimately this would be huge. It's not just one economical issue. Verse 12 says, "Where are they? Where are your wise men? Let them tell you now, and let them know that the Lord of hosts has purposed against Egypt." Now, even the wisest of people would not be able to explain the effects of God's judgment. Nothing they could advise would help them. You know, if somebody comes and asks you a question of how to do something specific and you don't know how to do it, you'll try to figure out how to tell them. These guys couldn't tell them anything that could actually help them because they had no knowledge. It was all a surprise to them as well. And then it goes on, it says, "The princes of Zoan have become fools. The princes of Noph were deceived. They have also deluded Egypt, those who are in the mainstay of its tribes." And again, there is no one wise enough to explain what's going on or how to fix what's going on. The princes of Zoan refers to the officials in Tanis. Now, Tanis was the primary city in northern Egypt from the middle of the Bronze Age forward. Essentially, Tanis would have been the capital city of what would have been Lower Egypt when the nation was broken into two. And they would offer insight to Pharaoh, and unfortunately, it would be insight that would not be effective. Now, the princes of Noph, those focus on the people that are wise in Egypt. They thought their wisdom was enough to get them through anything, and they were known for this incredible wisdom. But unfortunately, it would be seen as folly compared to what God was able to do. So nothing they could come up with could match or exceed anything that God was doing. Verse 14 and 15, it says, "The Lord has mingled a perverse spirit in their midst, and they have caused Egypt to err in all her work. As a drunken man staggers in his vomit, neither will there be any work for Egypt, which the head or tail, palm branch or bulrush may do." Now, these verses point to the confusion that would come as a result of the things that God was doing to the nation of Egypt. And it would be devastating and completely contrary to any of the wisdom that was spoken about in any of the verses prior. The interesting thing, though, is that Egypt had begun to slide even since 1200 BC. And it's not necessarily something that happens quickly, but something that slowly fades away. And you might get a similar picture of some other countries in our world today that has happened to as well. Verse 16, it says, "In that day Egypt will be like women and will be afraid and fear because of the waving of the hand of the Lord of hosts, which he waves over it. And the land of Judah will be a terror to Egypt. Anyone who makes mention of it will be afraid in himself because of the counsel of the Lord of hosts, which he has determined against it." Now, why do you think people would actually be afraid and theoretically, or even flinch, quite literally flinch every time God's hand was raised? Now, there would be no question where the judgment was coming from when it was coming. And God's people are simply that. They're God's people. And he would defend them and care for them much to the detriment of all of those who persecute them or hurt them. Egypt, Assyria, and Israel blessed is this next section. And in these verses, it really kind of includes a section that begins with verse 16. It seems to change from judgment and destruction to the idea of redemption. Now, the key idea of redemption in the phrase is repeated 5 times. And in verses 16, 18, 19, 23, and 24, it uses the phrase "in that day." Now, in this section as well, there are 2 primary purposes. One, it shows the nation of Israel that it is foolish to trust other nations who would ultimately face judgment. It's foolish to trust others when you need to be trusting God. And 2, it shows a general promise that God would restore Israel even from bondage. And I think those are things that we as God's people today need to grasp a hold of as well. We need to have that general information and understand that God's in the redeeming thing, not so much just the hurting or the persecution thing. Make no mistake, though, he'll persecute those that hurt his people. But for us, we need to understand that God wants to bless us, and we don't need to go anywhere else for help. We need to go directly to him. Now in verse 18 it says, "In that day 5 cities in the land of Egypt will speak the language of Canaan and swear by the Lord of hosts. One will be called the city of destruction." Now this indicates that when faced with utter destruction, even the kingdom of Egypt would turn their eyes toward God for help. They would realize there's no other way. And the 5 cities referenced seem to indicate that 5 out of every 6 cities in Egypt would turn their eyes toward God. Now they would even adapt the Hebrew language, and then the 5 cities reference is something that is complicated to narrow down to specific meanings. However, the Egyptians would feel the pain and they would look for help, and so there's this obvious outcry that would come. And then verse 19 says, "In that day there will be an altar to the Lord in the midst of the land of Egypt, and a pillar to the Lord at its border. And it will be a sign and for a witness to the Lord of hosts in the land of Egypt, for they will cry to the Lord because of the oppressors. And he will send them a Savior and a mighty one, and he will deliver them. Then the Lord will be known to Egypt, and the Egyptians will know the Lord in that day, and will make sacrifice and offering. Yes, they will make a vow to the Lord and perform it, and the Lord will strike Egypt. He will strike and heal it. They will return to the Lord, and he will be entreated by them and heal them." Now remember that Egypt, very proud of their wisdom, but it was being made to look foolish because their wisdom wasn't working. So what do you need to understand, I think, is this. Although there is judgment against Egypt, there are people who would potentially come to God in faith. For you and I, have you ever run into people that you don't feel have any kind of redeeming value? Yeah, those people. There is a redeeming value. Anybody and everybody is a potential Jesus follower. God chose you and I to go tell them. And they may ultimately choose no, but you don't know unless you tell them. So, what are your thoughts about all of that? You know, the beginning of this section talks about an altar. You certainly find some issues with finding an altar or a temple to God in Egypt. However, the Egyptians would come to know God, that is Yahweh, and they would build something similar to what was spoken about with Abraham when he set up something to honor God. Now, the turning of Egypt to God would indicate a turning to Egypt from God. It would be a relationship that would grow and would become something like a relation between a parent and a child. And God brings all of that about even through this persecution of them for what they were doing to his people. They would begin to openly worship Yahweh, and it would usher in a significant change in the world. Look forward here. It says, "In that day," this is verse 23, "there will be a highway from Egypt to Assyria, and the Assyrian will come into Egypt, and the Egyptian into Assyria, and the Egyptians will serve with the Assyrians. In that day Israel will be one of three with Egypt and Assyria, a blessing in the midst of the land, whom the Lord of hosts shall bless, saying, Blessed is Egypt, my people, and Assyria, the work of my hands, and my Israel, my inheritance. Now, these two are important, and they add a climax to the whole chapter, if you will. But Isaiah is pointing ultimately to the ending of enmity between Syria and Egypt. No longer would Israel be stuck in between them and have these two warring powers using Israel like a tennis ball bouncing back and forth. And it would fulfill an ancient promise as well that's found in Genesis 12:3, and it reads, In you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. Now, beginning in verse 24, it shows the blessing that would come when the nations are actually under God and united instead of dominating each other. What a picture of unity. We could certainly use a lot more unity, both in the church but also in our world, just among people. Well, that was chapter 19. So here we get into chapter 20, and this one's a lot shorter. In the year that Tartan came to Ashdod, when Sargon, the king of Assyria, sent him, and he fought against Ashdod and took it, at the same time the Lord spoke by Isaiah the son of Amos, saying, Go and remove the sackcloth from your body and take your sandals off your feet. And he did so, walking naked and barefoot. Then the Lord said, Just as my servant Isaiah has walked naked and barefoot 3 years for a sign and a wonder against Egypt and Ethiopia, so shall the king of Assyria lead away the Egyptians as prisoners and the Ethiopians as captives, young and old, naked and barefoot, with their buttocks uncovered, to the shame of Egypt. Then they shall be afraid and ashamed of Ethiopia, their expectation, and Egypt, their glory. And the inhabitant of this territory will say in that day, Surely such is our expectation. Wherever we flee for help to be delivered from the king of Assyria, and how shall we escape? Now, commentators indicate that Isaiah may have used some language here that seemed to indicate his careful focus on Egypt and that they should not be frustrated. Now, this section ends the oracles against Egypt, and it seems to be placed somewhere between the years of 713 and 711, although there are others that put it somewhere as late as 587. And before we get caught up in numbers and dates and times and stuff like that, it really doesn't matter. It's just the thing that happened. The specific date which it happened doesn't really matter, but it's just an interesting topic if you start digging into it. Ashdod's the leading of the revolt in Egypt. Tartan would be one of the three chief officers of the empire, and you can see that in 2 Kings 18:17 if you want to look that up. The idea that Egypt is mighty and unable to be conquered is foolish. However, they could not, just as Israel found out, defend themselves without God. And it would be embarrassing to be able to try to do that. And Isaiah is speaking, and when you read through different commentaries, you'll find much debate over Isaiah's speech and how it may not be specific to the timeline, as there are several problems with it, not the events themselves, or not, just make sure you understand that it's not on the events themselves. So let's focus on them. First of all, coming into public nude would have been something that would have been embarrassing and not acceptable. But the events would have been quick, and they would have been caught by surprise. The idea that Isaiah removed sackcloth most likely indicates a timing thing where he was still mourning for the destruction of the northern kingdom that was completed by Sargon in 720. So you can see where you might get the 713 and 711 numbers. Egypt would be shamed as well, which is reference to them being taken away with their behinds out. So there's all kinds of stuff in there about language. But just understand that God's judgment was swift and it was quick, and unfortunately they were not prepared for it. And for you and I, when catastrophe strikes, we're typically not prepared for it either. And so all kinds of stuff goes wrong when that happens. Well, that was chapter 20, and so let's go into chapter 21. It said there are four articles seen in chapters 20 and 21. Commentators point to each of them having more of an atmospheric approach instead of one that is rational. So let's explain that by just diving in. So here you start seeing Babylon. involved. So the first 10 verses of this, let me read through these and then I'll kind of go back and explain them. The burden against the wilderness of the sea, as whirlwinds in the south pass through, so it comes from the desert, from the terrible land. A distressing vision is declared in me, or to me. The treacherous dealer deals treacherously, and the plunderer plunders. Go up, O Elam, besiege, O Media. All its sighing I have made to cease. Therefore my loins are filled with pain. Pangs have taken hold of me, like the pangs of a woman in labor. I was distressed when I heard it. I was dismayed when I saw it. My heart wavered. Fearfulness frightened me. The night for which I longed, he turned into fear for me. Prepare the table, set a watchman in the tower. Eat and drink. Arise, you princes, anoint the shield. For thus has the Lord said to me, go, set a watchman. Let him declare what he sees. And he saw a chariot with a pair of horsemen, a chariot of donkeys and a chariot of camels. And he listened earnestly with great care. Then he cried, O lion, my Lord. I stand continually at the watchtower in the daytime. I have sat at my post every night. And look, here comes a chariot of men with a pair of horsemen. Then he answered and said, Babylon is fallen, and the carved images of her God. He has broken to the ground. Oh, my threshing and the grain of my floor, that which I have heard from the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, I have declared to you. Now, in these first 10 verses, you see what looks like an oracle against Babylon. And in the first verse, it mentions that what appears to be a reference to Mesopotamia. Now, it is called the Sea Land, but it's really a desert in terms of its capacity to help others. So it's kind of empty of being able to help others. Now, the impact would be devastating, which is illustrated by the mention of the whirlwinds passing through. It's representative of the seasonal storms that would come through and pass through that area, and they would be absolutely decimating and difficult to get through, but they would be huge. And so it would be quick, swift, and very painful. In verse 2, it indicates a distressing vision, but is further heightened when you look at the other translations that indicate a severe vision. It doesn't indicate that the writer enjoys seeing what he is seeing. It means that it is something that would bring doom, and the writer indicates gloom in it. But not just for the sake of mentioning it. He seems to be actually surprised by it. Now, the end of the verse indicates that God would deal with them abruptly. And I know that a lot of the stuff gets to where it seems like it's the same thing over and over again. But hear me here. Do we do the same thing? Do we find ourselves falling back into habits and into things that we do that are not godly? And then we go through the same thing over and over and over again because of our choices. We see that with God's people throughout history. We see where there are times where they're in lockstep with God and everybody's being blessed. And then we see these times where they pull away and they want to do their own thing. It's not any different than today. Anyway, verse 3 and 4, it shows us the impact of the vision on the author or the prophet. And he is, again, overwhelmed by it. And it's the imagery in the verses show it. You can see it if you just read it closely. Verse 5 indicates the speed with which the judgment would come, and it would be a surprise and wouldn't take into account any other responsibilities or traditions. When disaster happens, it's not paying attention to your schedule. Verse 6 through 9 changes back from Babylon to Judah, and the prophet's looking toward the east for signs of the Babylonians' fall. The part is also picked up by Jesus in Matthew 24, and you can look at verses 7 and 29 to get that. In verse 10, it can be taken as a word of encouragement or a word of regret. I mean, pick your poison. The people in this verse are compared to the grain on the threshing floor. The grain is broken up and it's put into the air where the shaft blows away and the grain falls to the floor. There's also hope in here, as God would bring some hope through the judgment. And we talk about remnants and we talk about stuff left behind. There's still good left behind, but unfortunately all the good ends up going through some of the bad to get there. Verse 11, it says, the burden against Duma, he calls to me out of Seir, watchman, what of the night? Watchman, what of the night? The watchman said, the morning comes and also the night. If you will inquire, return, come back. Now these two verses indicate a change. First, there's a change in position and maybe even perspective from a watchman in the tower, which you saw earlier. And then now it appears to be more a watchman on the wall, or what would be considered a guard. And the guard has multiple functions, but part of the thing for the guard is they recognize the coming of the new day. And so they would literally see the end of a long night, because they would see the first graying on the horizon. And so they would announce the day coming in. So the guard's looking out and he's looking forward. So you see that change right there. And the guard identifies the idea that there is hope within the city. There's a new day coming. And there's no clear picture painted on the last line of verse 12, but one might get the idea that there is a call for help, return and come back. Verse 13, 14, and 15, it says, the burden against Arabia. In the forest in Arabia you will lodge. Oh, you traveling companies of Dedanites. Oh, inhabitants of the land of Tema. Bring water to him who is thirsty. With their bread they met him who fled, for they fled with the sword from the drawn sword, from the bent bow, and from the distress of war. Now this identifies Arabia, but it primarily points towards allies, if you will, of Babylon. Now the area is large enough, or the larger area that we're talking about here is an area known as Kedar. You'll see that here in just a moment. Nabonidus would have a headquarters set up in Tema during the self-imposed exile from Babylon in 552. Interestingly, though, the author indicates a forest in Arabia. Now, there's really not any indication that the author used sarcasm, but when's the last time that you saw a forest in the middle of the desert? And really what it means is it indicates that there's something off of the beaten path. It's something that's out of the norm. Most likely caravans were being forced off of the road because of heavy pedestrian traffic. So as the people fled, they used the roads. And so anybody with caravans, with animals, with stuff like that, were trying to also use the roads, and they ended up going off the beaten path to get around all of the people as they were using the road. Now the verses seem to also indicate that mass exile, and unfortunately there would be many who would not escape. That we close up here with 16 and 17. It says, for thus the Lord has said to me, within a year, according to the year of a hired man, all the glory of Kedar will fail, and the remainder of the number of archers, the mighty men of the people of Kedar, will be diminished, for the Lord God of Israel has spoken it. Now, guys, this is absolute judgment here, and you got to understand that they would have been heavily armed, they would have had a lot of men, and no matter how much might man thinks they have, God's always got more power. And I love where it finishes, and it's just literally the voice of God. Doesn't have to be something manual, but God speaks it into existence. And then God would speak into existence the punishment and ultimately the judgment for the people. I hope that clears up some things for you. If you're reading that, Isaiah is certainly an interesting book, but that gives us one chapter from last week and two more for this week. I want to remind you again that chapter 22, which would be for next week, we're not going to have that one on video because I'm not going to physically do it, but Chris will cover for me, and that'll be taken care of live. So I want to encourage you to come be a part of that at 6:30 in the fellowship hall at the church. I love you. I pray that God will bless your socks off, for lack of better words, and I pray that you will have a good rest of the week.